Timothy Weber's doctoral dissertation, which is now, the last few years, it has been available in book form, titled Living in the Shadow of the Second Coming, American Premillennialism from 1875 to 1925. A title, by the way, which I borrowed for some of our screw tape studies some time ago. And a book, notice the years, which more or less correspond with George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, is trying to explain the birth and the great rise of premillennialism in American eschatology at the turn of the century on the basis of behaviorism, or explaining it with the help of behaviorism, and asking the question, if evangelicals became premillennialists at the turn of this century, how did that affect their behavior? In other words, if you believe that the appearance, the second coming, the second advent of Christ was imminent, then did that alter your lifestyle? One thing to have the doctrine, did it alter your lifestyle? And in answering yes, it did, he's going to paint a picture, which I just thought I would read because I've recently read this book, and so it's fresh on my mind, some of these fundamentalist taboos that we've talked about so often, and that we are looking at again this morning by discussing legalistic repulsion as an improper position for world denying. American evangelicalism has always been a blend of doctrine and duty. Although evangelicals disagreed on church government, we've seen that with the KJV, and church polity, reading in bishopric and things like that, modes of baptism, and certain particulars of doctrine, nearly all agreed that true believers in Christ must both believe correctly and behave properly. You must have doctrine and deeds, theology and ethics. Profession and practice went hand in hand. As a result, evangelicals developed almost the same ideas about what constituted the ideal Christian life, though their list of do's and don'ts differed slightly from group to group. The standard taboos included breaking the Sabbath, attending the dance or the theater, use of alcohol and tobacco, and gambling. Naturally, not all evangelicals could agree on any one particular list, but most did agree that Christians should avoid, quote, worldly amusements, unquote, however defined, and that they would be immeasurably better off if they maintained a close watch on their personal habits and deportment in the world. Here's the first time that we really have in church history, in American church history, a rise of these legalisms, of these do's and don'ts. Not surprisingly, at times, such an approach became superficially legalistic and self-defeating. Such assumptions about the Christian life suffered almost irreparable damage in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. New temptations in the cities, materialism, which resulted from industrialization, the new woman, and the resulting pressures of family life, the unprecedented effects of mass advertising and merchandising, changing dress styles, new amusements, and Freud's findings on the power of human sexuality made the earlier evangelical values seem archaic and irrelevant. The revolution in morals became a serious threat to traditional lifestyles and behavior patterns. Premillennialists claimed that nothing inspired people to holiness of life more than belief in the imminent coming of Christ. Those who expected Jesus to come soon practiced a strict, quote, separation from the world. In 1888, Samuel H. Kellogg, a pre-mill who had served as a missionary to India and as a seminary professor, observed that, quote, the modern, easy-living, card-playing, theater-going, dancing type of Christian is very rarely found to be one who has learned to look for the Lord's pre-millennial advent. Pre-mills then discovered in their own particular doctrine a way of reinforcing slipping evangelical mores. Apart from their distinctive approach, dispensationalists opposed worldliness on the same basis as other evangelicals. For example, they deplored the changing styles in women's fashions, generally considering any rise of the hemline or reduction in the number of petticoats as a disgusting effrontery to modesty and invitation to masculine lust. In 1916, the editors of the Christian Workers magazine complained that women went to their shops, factories, stores, and offices arrayed in clothes short at both ends and skimpy in the middle. No wonder, they observed, the women attract the unworthy attention of ungodly men and inflame their passion to direful results. If pious pre-mills were scandalized in 1916, when skirts rarely, if ever, rose above 6 inches above the shoe tops, they were close to apoplexy when the flappers of the 1920s bobbed their hair, bound their breasts to hide their feminine curves, wore dresses up to their knees, and even rolled their stockings below their kneecaps. In other words, what they try to say in things like this is that people change with culture. And what once was looked down upon as horror, it's 8 inches above the top of your shoes now, is not looked on with horror so much, and therefore, if we try to legislate, however many inches now, then our grandchildren will look on us as we cannot believe they were so narrow-minded. That's what they're trying to show, that people change, culture change, taste change, and therefore it's a little ludicrous, to say nothing else of perhaps unscriptural, to try to bind people by a certain dress code here. In the resultant controversy over dress styles, the critics of high fashion seemed more concerned about its adverse effects on men than anything else. Some pre-mills even wanted to hold scantily clad girls responsible for the delinquency of young men. Dancing had been considered sinful by many evangelicals before the turn of the century, charismatic and non. The development of new and even more daring dance steps did little to mitigate their convictions. The main objection to dancing was that such close proximity between the sexes could result in nothing but a lessening of sexual morality. In 1907, Reuben Torrey admitted that dancing was not a sin as long as men and women don't do it together. Took care of that, didn't he? And see, that's a good argument. Go ahead and tell people that's all right to dance. We believe in dancing as long as you don't do it together. And see how many people want to dance then. See, doesn't that almost rule out dancing? That proves, why are you dancing then? You doing it for exercise? Well, you'd be willing to dance with a male partner alone in the woods somewhere. Maybe you wouldn't in our day and age, but dance with yourself maybe somewhere else. People be willing to dance as long as you've got the sexes mixed. So maybe is that saying something about your dancing? Torrey had a good point here. He says dancing is not a sin as long as you don't do it in mixed company. Dispensationalists, like all the more conservative evangelicals, considered such things as the turkey trot, the grizzly bear, the fox trot, the one-step, toddle, shimmy, and the Charleston as nothing short of obscene. And see, what do we do today? We kind of laugh on that rococo form of argument there. That was so naive and so simple back in the good old days. And now we have to heighten our form of sexual explicitness in dancing before we condemn dancing now. As a former dancing master confessed, many of the couples performing these dances should have a marriage license before stepping out on the ballroom floor. And if they had a marriage license, there'd be no excuse for committing such acts in public. Another way to get around that. Brilliant guys here. Everyone knew that praying knees and dancing feet never seemed to go very well together, and that dancing aroused its participants. T.C. Horton of the Bible Institute of L.A. once asked his men's Bible class how many had ever danced. Nearly every one of the 300 men present raised his hand. This is what you call an ancient scientific poll here. When he asked to see the hands of those who had only, quote, pure thoughts, unquote, while dancing, not a hand in the room went up. Thus, dancing is evil. That's an old scientific poll. Under such circumstances, Christians should avoid dancing. Certainly one who expected the imminent return of the Lord would not want to be locked in the grizzly bear when the Son of Man came from the clouds of heaven. The theater, and later on the moving picture, received strong denunciation from pre-mills. In 1919, the Institute Tie, which was a magazine, noted the new movie industry's potential for good, but by the next year its editors were claiming that movies contaminated the minds of the young people. And can you imagine what movies were playing in 1919? Movies portrayed immoral or unsuitable stories about robbers, gamblers, drunkards, fighting husbands and wives, and various forms of crime. They invariably put unwholesome ideas into the heads of all who saw them. After spending Saturday afternoon in the neighborhood movie house, people would find church dull on Sunday morning. One critic claimed that churchgoers who attended the cinema would soon demand ragtime music during worship services and try to bring motion pictures into the house of God. Wasn't that a prophecy that came true? 1915, A.C. Gabeline observed that full movie houses on Sunday evening meant a substantial drop in church attendance. Movies corrupted the young, undercut the convictions of the old, and diverted attention away from the church. Christians, therefore, must have nothing to do with them. Examples of such sentiments could be multiplied, but the point has already been made. Pre-mills maintain the traditional cultural taboos of the evangelical constituency, altering their lists of don'ts when changing mores made it necessary. What disturbed most Protestants about the revolution of morals in America disturbed pre-mills. They in turn did everything in their power to resist the popular trends, using their doctrine of the imminent second coming of Jesus as an added incentive to flee from temptation. You see, that's true. People have changed their lists as culture has changed and as mores have changed. And so maybe that's one in a series of some rather powerful arguments against ever drawing up lists of what may or may not be done. It's such a reductionism for all the obvious reasons and the problems it causes, as we pointed out earlier. It's best to understand, why is it you're outlawing movies? Why is it you're outlawing a certain form of woman's dress? I mean, is it scandalous for the dress to rise from 6 inches above the shoe tops to 9 inches? For people who have the doctrine of 6 inches, 9 inches would be scandalous. Well, what is it about those 3 inches that's, what is the intent? I mean, whenever we stripped everything away, what is it about 3 inches? What is it about 3 inches that causes the problem? Or are we really not talking about 3 inches? What we're talking about, you are manifesting a certain type of spirit or behavior. That's a spirit that's going to lead to something else. That's what was behind a lot of the fundamentalists and pre-mills and charismatics lists of do's and don'ts. But they weren't able at all, in my opinion, to articulate what was behind it. They simply had the list there. They didn't ask themselves, why are we doing this? If we can answer why, can't we somehow develop that in our teaching? Let that be our teaching. Some deeper spiritual import. Let that be our teaching, and do away with these lists of things. Well, people would say, what if someone fell and went into one of the things they weren't supposed to do? But the spiritual teaching would be the things to keep them out. And if it didn't, then a list is certainly no better substitute. It's a substitute, and it's not better than the spiritual teaching. If they're going to fall, they're going to fall. So should we have those lists? I'm going to return to John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, and pick up the story where I left off with this thought this morning. How does legalism affect children? That's an interesting study that I've looked into you just have to look in the last 80 years. And we're going to get another good picture from Steinbeck's novel here of how does legalism affect children. You see, as an adult, somehow, although you're not totally competent, you're able to wrestle with more, and you're able to see more than just the list of things you should and shouldn't do. But for a child, are they able to see any more than that? Are they not more like a robot? You're not like a robot. You're broader. Because you're more mature and older, and you've lived long, and you've been places and done things, you can touch base in different places. They don't have any reference point. They don't have anything to bounce something off of. All they have is that list that says, you cannot do this. You cannot do that. You cannot do that. Well, we left Rose of Sharon, headed back to the tent, after this woman had come and threatened her, and Maul picks up a stick after the woman, and she falls down, and a man is crying, she's got the spirit, she's got the spirit. A crowd of people have gathered around the woman to watch what has happened, and the manager of this government camp where these people are shows up. The manager looked at Moll, looked down at the stick in her hand. He smiled tiredly. "Did you clout her?" he asked. Moll continued to stare after the retreating people. She shook her head slowly. "No, but I woulda, twice today. She worked my girl up." The manager said, "Try not to hit her. She isn't well. She just isn't well." And he added softly, "I wish she'd go away and all her family. She brings more trouble on the camp than all the rest together." Moll got herself in hand again. "If she comes back, I might hit her. I ain't sure. I won't let her worry my girl no more." "Don't worry about it, Mrs. Joad," he said. "You won't ever see her again. She works over the newcomers. She will never come back. She thinks you're a sinner." "Well, I am," said Moll. "Sure, everybody is, but not the way she means. She isn't well, Mrs. Joad." Moll went into the tent and sat down beside Rose of Sharon. "Look up," she said. The girl lay still. Moll gently lifted the blanket from her daughter's face. "That woman's kind of crazy," she said. "Don't you believe none of them things?" Rose of Sharon whispered in terror. "But when she said about a burning, I felt burning." "That ain't true," said Moll. "I'm tired out," the girl whispered. "I'm tired of things happening. I want to sleep. I want to sleep." "Well, you sleep then. This here's a nice place. You can sleep." "But she might come back." "She won't," said Moll. "I'm going to set right outside, and I won't let her come back. You rest up now, 'cause you got to get to work in the nursery pretty soon." Now remember what the thing is pointing toward is their Saturday night get-together with a string band. So let's let Steinbeck tell us what's going on. On Saturday morning, the wash tubs were crowded. The women washed dresses, pink ginghams, flowered cottons, and they hung them in the sun and stretched the cloth to smooth it. When afternoon came, the whole camp quickened and the people grew excited. The children caught the fever and were more noisy than usual. About mid-afternoon, child bathing began, and as each child was caught, subdued, and washed, the noise of the playground gradually subsided. Before 5, the children were scrubbed and warned about getting dirty again. And they walked about, stiff in clean clothes, miserable with carefulness. There's Steinbeck at his best again. At the big open dance platform, a committee was busy. Every bit of electric wire had been requisitioned. The city dump had been visited for wire. Every toolbox had contributed friction tape. And now the patched, spliced wire was strung out to the dance floor with bottlenecks as insulators. This night the floor would be lighted for the first time. By 6 o'clock the men were back from work, or from looking for work, and a new wave of bathing started. By 7, dinners were over. Men had on their best clothes, freshly washed overalls, clean blue shirts, sometimes the decent blacks. The girls were ready in their print dresses, stretched and clean, their hair braided and ribboned. The worried women watched the families and cleaned up the evening dishes. On the platform, the string band practiced, surrounded by a double wall of children. The people were intent and excited. And now the dusk was falling, and as the darkness deepened, the practicing of the string band seemed to grow louder. The lights flashed on, and 2 men inspected the patched wire to the dance floor. The children crowded thickly about the musicians. A boy with a guitar sang the down-home blues, chording delicately for himself, and on his second chorus, 3 harmonicas and a fiddle joined him. From the tents, the people streamed toward the platform, men in their clean blue denim, women in their ginghams. They came near to the platform, and then stood quietly, waiting, their faces bright and intent under the light. Now the cars of the guests began to arrive, small farmers and their families, migrants from other camps. And as each guest came through the gate, he mentioned the name of the camper who had invited him. The string band took a real tune-up and played loudly, for they were not practicing any more. In front of their tents, the Jesus lovers sat and watched, their faces hard and contemptuous. They did not speak to one another. They watched for sin, and their faces condemned the whole proceeding. Dancing had not formally started, but now Willie climbed onto the platform. "Choose up your squares," he called. The music started. Boys and girls, young men and women ran about until 8 squares were ready on the big floor, ready and waiting. The girls held their hands in front of them and squirmed their fingers. The boys tapped their feet restlessly. Around the floor the old folks sat, smiling slightly, holding the children back from the floor. And in the distance, the Jesus lovers sat with hard, condemning faces and watched the sin. Ma and Rose of Sharon sat on a bench and watched, and as each boy asked Rose of Sharon his partner, Ma said, "No, she ain't well," and Rose of Sharon blushed and her eyes were bright. The caller stepped to the middle of the floor and held up his hands. "All ready? Then let her go." The music snarled out chicken reel, shrill and clear, fiddles skirling, harmonicas nasal and sharp, the guitars booming on the bass strings. The caller named the turns. The squares moved. They danced forward and back, hands round, swing your lady. The caller in a frenzy tapped his feet, strutted back and forth, went through the figures as he called them. Swing your ladies in a dulce-do, join hands round and away we go. The music rose and fell and the moving shoes beat in time on the platform. Their beating sounded like drums. Swing to the right and a swing to the left. Break, now break, back to back, the caller sang, the high, vibrant monotone. Now the girls' hair lost the careful combing. Now perspiration stood out on the foreheads of the boys. Now the experts showed the tricky intersteps. The old people on the edge of the floor took up the rhythm and patted their hands softly and tapped their feet, and they smiled gently and then caught one another's eyes and nodded. Ma leaned her head close to Rose of Sharon's ear. "Maybe you wouldn't think it, but your pa was as nice a dancer as I ever seen when he was young." And Ma smiled. "Makes me think of old times," she said. On the faces of the watchers, the smiles were of old times. "Up near Muskogee 20 years ago, they was a blind man with a fiddle." Someone interrupts. "I seen a fellow once could slap his heel 4 times in one jump." Someone else speaks up. "Swedes up in Dakota, know what they do sometimes? Put pepper on the floor. Gets up the ladies' skirts and makes them pretty lively as a filly in season. Swedes do that sometimes." And in the distance, the Jesus lovers watched their restive children. "Look on sin," they said. "Them folks is riding to hell on a poker. It's a shame the godly got to see it." And their children were silent and nervous. He comes back to those Jesus lovers 3 times during that dance there. They're always in the distance, looking with hard, contemptuous, condemning faces. The last time he comes back to them, this last occasion I just read, he says the Jesus lovers are watching, and you expect watching their restive children. And what are happening now? The children are nervous. So this is what I want to talk about this morning, the subject of children and legalism. In that one sentence, I think in Steinbeck captures it all. Because here's what I mean by saying that it captures it all. Those children, being children, whether they're lost or saved or Jesus lovers or Jesus haters, they're enthralled with this string band over here and all these people dancing and all of this, and yet they know that their parents have forbidden this activity of them, forbidden them to even like it. You can look on it and know that these people are riding to hell on a poker, but you can't even like it. And what did the children experience but an extreme tension and conflict in them? Their parents say no. Their desires, you see, say yes. They're just children. They want to go do this. Parents don't explain anything about it. It's just they look with hard, contemptuous, condemning faces on the whole thing. And we know what we mean by that from the last service, reading that whole account of what that woman had to say to Rose of Sharon and to Ma. Now you see, the adult who's got these beliefs, if he has had them since a child, he went through that same period that his children are going through now. A very restive children. The children were restive, they were nervous. He's so confirmed in his beliefs now, he doesn't have that friction or that tension, that conflict anymore as he's reached adulthood. But it's there in the children because the children don't have an explanation for why these things are happening. They don't have an explanation. All they know is that's bad, that's evil. That's how I'm tying it into our first 2 points here of the superstitious notion as well as the legalistic notion. That's all that the child knows. It's bad, 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 wrong, sinful, take you to hell, the devil's in this place. They don't know anything else. They can't put their finger on anything else. Their parents haven't even tried to lift them any higher. And so what does Steinbeck say? The children are nervous. You have to picture the children looking at their parents and with hard condemning faces, and then looking at the camp, seeing all the other boys and girls laughing and playing. It doesn't look like they're doing anything that's sinful over there, just having a good time on Saturday night, not hurting anything or anybody. And then back at their parents, and then back at the dance, and then back at their parents, and back at the dance. And that would make a person nervous. That would fill a person with tension and conflict. And if you know anything about fundamentalism, this is how children are brought up. They're brought up with a list of things that you can't do. And as a result, well, one of two things will happen. They'll grow up just like their parents, with no more thought about the matter. They simply, no, this is wrong. You can't. It's a superstitious, legalistic notion. It's a repulsion to it based on the wrong motives and the wrong reason. Or, and this is what is, well, both of them are dangerous. They'll grow up, and they'll get away from home, and they'll get a little more knowledge and a little more education, and they will violently revolt against what they were taught. Yeah. You don't have really but those two choices unless the grace of God comes on the scene and saves the person and brings them into a right knowledge of what's going on. One or the other of those two things will happen. And I don't think a lot of parents who have superstitious fears and legalisms realize how that's going to affect, how it is affecting now their children, and how it will affect them as they grow up. If we as adults have legalistic, superstitious notions of do's and don'ts, cans and can'ts, those will pass off right to our children. And those children will either grow up just like us as legalists and superstitious, or they'll grow up revolting against that, angry with their parents for telling them you can't do this and never explaining anything, any of the philosophy. No, didn't give them any worldview. Didn't give them anything that was the point of focus that could add, consistency to everything else that they tried to approach. You've got to have something around which everything else revolves, or it just won't work. You can't just have planets and things just going in every different direction. You've got to have a focal point. Everything revolves around this. Your don'ts and do's, or your cans and can'ts, or mays or may nots, or this is best and this is not as good, has to revolve around something else. And that's what has always been missing in fundamentalism. And so I brought an article along that I think expresses this vividly from someone's personal testimony. They grew up through this, what he calls later in the article, the harsh fundamentalism of my childhood. The harsh fundamentalism of my childhood. Got a little education, went to college, and chose to revolt against all of that. Thankfully, he's revolting against his revolt. In other words, he's coming back to a knowledge of God and sin. But as I don't think I'm going to tell you now, but I'll bring this article later in Systematic Theology, he comes back to a dreadful conclusion that a lot of people have in theological circles today. It's entitled Sin. The beautiful picture, it was done by one of the associate editors, Yancey, of Christianity Today. Beautiful picture of men and women riding home on a bus. Now you hold, if you don't find a seat there, you hold on to one of the straps up there, and you see what they're holding on to? A serpent, a snake, reading their magazine, reading their newspapers as they go home. It starts the article with two quotes, one from C.S. Lewis and another from William Faulkner. Here's what Lewis had to say about sin. All day long and all the days of our life, we are sliding, slipping, falling away, as if God were, to our present consciousness, a smooth, inclined plane on which there is no resting. William Faulkner, that famous Mississippi novelist, in a little more folksy way, describes sin as this: I ain't got to, but I can't help it. So here he starts the article. Sin. The very word has slithery reptilian sounds to it. For me, the word summons up overtones from the past, when heavy-breathing Southern revivalists would stretch it out in full two-syllable fury. "Sion!" they would shout, and raise their fist in defiance against the satanic force that lay in wait for each of us, that lay in wait inside of us. I trembled as a child when I heard about sin and the horrors of its punishment. Subconsciously, my images of God were forming as I listened to those revivalists. God was no father to me, for I had no image of father to draw on. Mine died of polio just after my first birthday. So God was more like the authority figures I knew, especially the tank-like German matron who inspired fear in the hearts of any first grader daring to whisper or throw spitballs in her domain. Only God was far larger and stricter, the strictest teacher imaginable. Martin Luther grew up haunted by a stained glass window from his boyhood church, a window depicting Christ as a stern king with a raised sword. The sword appeared to Luther exactly like a rod. To my child's mind also, God loomed as the great enforcer who brought swift and terrible punishment to all who misbehaved. And it did not help that church members told me my earthly father, now in heaven, was looking down on me to help spy out my hidden sins. These type of influences that are just pounding away on children. You say, well, in our day and age, you don't have those influences as much. That's true. You don't have them as much. That's part of the whole problem that we're going to be addressing right here. Because of the false presentation of a lot of these people, the church in general has just decided to give up this business of worldliness or separation. We're just going to have to give up on that. We've tried being non-worldly or otherworldly before, and look what it's done. We ended up in legalism as a result of our attempt. That's exactly right. I don't think that's cause enough to give up the whole business of trying to stay away from the world and its temptations. But how do we stay away then? Those children do. The first opportunity, they rebel against all of that. And then what does that do? It gives a horrible name for anyone who tries to live a disciplined Christian life. And one or the other of these scenarios, either the child grows up a legalist and superstitious like you, or he grows up revolting, one or the other of those will be true of your children if you don't approach worldliness from a different worldview. So all your children are small. We're really getting a head start on this. You have to learn right now. If they see all that superstitiousness in you, they're going to have the same superstitiousness in them. Or they'll choose to say, I can't believe my mother and father were so ignorant. I can't believe I got away to school, or I got with some of my friends, and they explain life as it really is to me without all of these mystical Central American taboos, demonic type taboos and superstitious notions that they have. Parents get in this and they kind of neglect bringing their children up in it the way that they should. The Scripture has some to say on that. Not a whole lot, by the way. So you may be surprised in me saying that. I wasn't going to say the Scripture has a lot to say about it. It doesn't have a lot to say about it. It has some to say about it. The New Testament has minuscule to say about how to bring your children up. Oh, I wonder why. I mean, quote the passages. Tell me where the passages are that talk about child rearing in the New Testament. You don't have very many, do you? You probably think of Ephesians 6, and when you've said Ephesians 6, you've said it all. That's about it right there in Ephesians 6. You don't have much anywhere else. In other words, I think what we are to get through all of that is that as the adult themselves matures in the faith, they're to understand what spiritual growth is all about. They're already an adult. They've gone through earthly existence in life. As they come into this, they're to understand, because they can compare the spiritual growth in their life with what natural growth is like, and struggles and things they've had, and then they should already have some type of storehouse of knowledge. How am I going to bring my child up in all of this sin without having them rebel against this later in life? Now, looking back, my early oppressive encounters with the word sin almost seemed to belong to someone who lived on another planet. I rarely come across the word these days in Christian books or magazines. Rarely hear it railed on or railed against from the pulpit. Never hear it on network television. Fear of sin, the dominant force of my childhood and that of many others, has nearly disappeared from view. I wonder what's caused that to happen. Fear of sin, he said, the dominant force in my childhood has disappeared from view. Well, I would have several statements to make about that. One, this man is a religious editor now, and I don't know that he's visiting all the places in the country today where that still is a dominant force in people's life. But I think, in the second place, overall, what he says is true. You don't see a lot on sin. You don't hear that word mentioned. You hear words like shortcoming or a mistake. But you don't hear what he says, that word that has a slithery reptilian sound to it, sin. Isn't it interesting how words are? Why we pick certain words for things. Look at the first letter there. What do you have but a big snake coiled around, a capital S? Slithery reptilian sound to sin. That's true. We don't hear a lot about that today. It is all but an extinct species today. I wonder why. I wonder if this is not true, that the very people, the fundamentalists who argued so strongly against sin because of their superstition and because of their legalism, they are the ones who killed their own child. The ones who gave birth to this sin business all the time are the ones who aborted their own child. You understand what I'm saying? They killed it because of their wrong approach or their wrong emphasis to it. And now you've got the neo-evangelicals today. You've got people today who all they can see in the New Testament is the love of God. 1 John is a book on love, the love of God. You don't ever hear any more about sin or fearing God. In other words, have people not reacted, we would say overreacted, but reacted against that. Reacted against this legalistic mentality of a list of do's and don'ts, and especially the list of taboos, including the things we're always mentioning here. Reacted so violently against that they just erase sin from popular speaking, from popular thought now. People don't talk about sin anymore. It's about love of God or doing good for your neighbor, one or the other. So you see, we can't react that far. We can't overreact against this and lose our concept of sin. Sin should be a dominant force in our life. I mean, the concept of sin should be a dominant force in our life. You can't help but read the prophets, and it was a dominant force of their life. Their life revolved around a concept of sin. That sin violates the extreme, unknowable holiness of God. It is an affront to His personal deity for little human beings to be running around sinning in their lives down here. Ever since Freud, the idea of behavior as a series of independent moral acts has given way to a much fuzzier image of behavior as the random expression of the vast subconsciousness. At one time, sin, obedience or disobedience, was linked to certain acts. You did this right, you did that wrong. Therefore, lying behind that would be the theme of responsibility. You are the one who sinned. You are responsible for that. But what if it's this vast subconscious id in you? You can't really trace it back to anything but all types of influences. Well, I had influence when I was a child, and my mother said this, and my father didn't love me, and my grandmother hated me, and my grandfather was overindulging, and all of this blended to make my personality, my vast subconsciousness, and now it, not I, it is responsible for my behavior today. Ever since Freud, that's what people have generally done. They can explain away their sins on the basis of, environmental upbringing. They're not held responsible for it anymore. Therefore, sin is not a dominant concept in people's life because sin kind of ceases to exist. It's not right or wrong, it's just an expression of your subconsciousness. Partly as a result, the concept of sin is in grave danger of extinction in our culture at large. Not long ago, George Bernard Shaw called the doctrine of original sin the only empirically verifiable Christian doctrine. Famous quote from Shaw, who did not agree with Christianity. The doctrine of original sin, the only empirically verifiable doctrine. We're going to look at this so-called law of verifiability in the Vienna Circle as one of the worldviews of positivism when we get to that here not too long in Christian ethics. But you know what something is when it's empirically verifiable. You can prove it. That's interesting. In other words, he's speaking from his own experience there. You can't prove, the atonement. You can't prove the virgin birth. You can't prove the resurrection. But one Christian doctrine Shaw said you can prove is original sin, because it's everywhere. It's in every human being's life. It's the only empirically verifiable Christian doctrine. Yancey goes on to write, but now I doubt whether a single one of the residents on my street would even recognize the phrase original sin. He says one might respond, I don't know, maybe some kind of kinky new fad. We thus find ourselves in the schizophrenic position of ignoring the most obvious fact about human behavior, the fact of sin. I suspect if a true prophet from God came in judgment against the sins of our modern culture, he would be greeted first with incredulous laughter, then scorn, then violent opposition. In parentheses, curiously, that's the exact same response the Old Testament prophets were greeted with. As I reflect on my own pilgrimage of faith, I find that it has mirrored the schizophrenia of the larger culture. Sometimes I'm dominated by sin consciousness. Sometimes I rebel vigorously against it. But most often, I avoid it completely. Sin as an abstract idea teaches very little. Sinners themselves teach much, and perhaps for that reason the Bible expresses in story form most of what it has to say about sin. And to learn about my own sin, I had to begin by tracing its progress in my life. I had to identify my sin, not just as a stray sin here or there, but patterns of sin that keep breaking out. Here are a few sins from my long list. I'm going to read these sins that he's confessing to an international audience here that are very interesting. And remember, he comes from a harsh, as he said, fundamentalist background, brought up with things you may and may not do. Went away to college and rebelled against all of that. And now it's the old, well, he's come of age story. He's coming home again, or the other metaphor is he's coming full circle. He's coming back to a knowledge of sin, a consciousness of sin, but he's going to have some problems now. What has happened in his life meantime? One sin, he says, is deceit. I am ashamed to admit it, but I have struggled with a consistent pattern of deceit. Earlier, justifying my deceit as a creative way to oppose the system, I would engage in such shenanigans as mailing all utility bill payments without postage stamps, causing the utility companies to pay postage until the postal service wised up and stopped delivering such mail. Subscribing to record clubs in order to tape record the records and then send them back for a refund. I know some lost people who wouldn't be caught doing things like this. They're more moral than that. That's my whole point here. What happened to this man here? He knew those things were sin, as he had heard those heavy-breathing Southern revivalists draw it out in full two-syllable form. He revolted against all of that. Over time, plagued by a guilty conscience, I cut out such practices. That's the only reason he did, evidently. But I still recognize a deep temptation to rely on deceit when I feel trapped. Permanent discontent, sin number 2. You may not find this one on any biblical list of sins, but this root attitude affects me in many sinful ways. Years of working as an editor gave me an editor's personality that is never satisfied. I always want to strike out words, rearrange sentences, crumple up whole first drafts. While such dyspepsia can serve a worthwhile purpose in editing, in life it does not. I find myself editing my wife's behavior and my friends. I constantly yearn for what I cannot have and cannot be. Mainly, I make myself nearly impervious to that spirit the Bible calls joy. Hypocrisy, sin number 3. All Christians fight against this sin to some degree. There I go again rationalizing. but writers perhaps more than most. I write about leprosy patients in India and about the extraordinary humility and sacrifice of missionaries I have visited there. But I write from the comfort of an air-conditioned office with strains of classical music being pumped into the room. How do I live with that disparity? How should I? Greed. Do you know of any ministry other than writing that has a one-to-one relationship between ministry and income? Each person I, quote, reach in a book means more money in my pocket. Need I detail the dangers of mixed motives that can result? Another sin, egotism. Again, a most embarrassing admission. I would prefer leave off my list of sins. Like every other author and speaker, I begin with the rather audacious assumption that I have a viewpoint worth listening to. If I did not believe that, I would not go through the painful process of writing. The danger of pride rides with every thought, every sentence, every word. You will note that my list of sins excludes many overt ones, such as child abuse, drunkenness, and adultery. I am not tempted toward those sins, and that fact offers my first clue into the nature of sin. Sin strikes at the point of greatest vulnerability. We who battle internal sins can easily think our sins somehow more respectable than more blatant sins such as adultery and drunkenness. The moment we entertain such thoughts, we fall into even a deeper hole. I have attended meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous and have never met a recovering alcoholic who denied his or her own sinfulness. But I have met many Christians who find it difficult to confess their own sins. I know such Christians. I know them well, for I am one. We can quickly work up ire against the decay of our society. Just witness the furor over abortion and violence and pornography and other external sins. But unless we come to terms with our private sins, we will have missed the message of the gospel. If you ever doubt that, simply turn to the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus painted with one brush lust and adultery, hatred and murder. In my childhood, thinking about sin terrified me. In my adolescence, it repulsed me. Yet now I find myself thinking about sin often and fruitfully. In other words, he's saying I've come full circle. He asks himself the question, what caused the change in perspective? I'll sum up this paragraph and a half. He said he studied more on grace and on the love of God. As I immersed myself in the writings of grace and God's love, many of the calluses that had grown thick against the harsh fundamentalism of my childhood began to soften and fall away. The first to fall was my image of God as a cruel and heartless teacher. I had viewed God as a cranky old codger who concocted an arbitrary list of rules for the express purpose of making sure everyone would be punished for breaking one or two of them. The rules made no sense in themselves, I thought, especially the 613 Old Testament laws. But I knew that I had to do them nevertheless. Now, I'm not going to read this last page here. I'll save that for theology. But he comes to a conclusion about what is the nature of sin, what is the nature of disobedience. That is so humanistic, that is so far away from Scripture, but a lot of people have it, and more today than ever before, that it's just hard for me to fathom. It's a neat little way, a real neat way, a catchy way of worming your way out of having to deal with sin. And I read you his life story, his example, to show you what happens. Here's what happens. One example of one person brought up with legalism as their worldview. They were a world denier, but they were a world denier because they were legalistic. They had a list of things that they could and couldn't do. Now, you'll hear people often make the complaint that if you force your child to do something whenever they're young, you hear this from the psychologists all the time. If you force your child to do something when they're young, they're going to get smart on you later on, and they're going to rebel against that. Well, how are we going to answer this then? We're going to just say to our children at the age of 1, 2, 3, 4, your life is your own. Do what you think best. We're just going to say, go ahead and do whatever you want to do. Did God not give us responsibilities as parents to bring our children up? Are we not to enforce things, compel submission to what we tell them to do? But must it not be in some other way than this fundamentalist way? That's the fine balance that we've got to find somehow. Are not children, have you not seen your children, your young ones, who have never been out in the world at all? You've raised them at home. They've never had any outside influence. You've taught them the gospel. They believe the gospel, and they see, maybe, I can't think of something right now, but some sinful attraction out there, and they're attracted to it right away. And you're almost embarrassed because you think, my child is spiritual. They wouldn't be attracted to that. You see, they're just a child. They're not attracted in their inner nature. They're curious about that. That's one thing that we have to see right away. You don't have something wrong with your child because you're attracted to that. Something that's sinful, maybe that neighborhood kids are doing. Because they're not attracted to that in the inner being. It hasn't been developed yet. They're curious about that. So what are we going to say? No, with a thundering voice? You say, well, no, we can't do that. What are we going to say then? Yes, you may do that. Well, we can't do that either. I mean, it has to be yes or no. It can't be maybe or your life is your own. So I think we would all agree with the no. No, you may not do that. But then there's another step. And son, here's why. Let me tell you about this. There's a huge difference between saying no. We will not discuss the matter. I don't have a reason why, just no. You may not smoke. You may not drink. You may not wear that type of outfit. You may not wear that type of T-shirt with Hulk Hogan on the front of it or whatever. Why may I not do that? They might not even be smart enough to ask. But you do them a great service to explain to them. You say, but boy, that'd be hard to explain though. That's what we're after here. What is your worldview? You're going to have to explain every no you tell them in light of what your worldview is. See, this is our overarching view of things. And that is why our worldview is what makes these things wrong then. If our worldview, if the way we have interpreted the world, God, the Scriptures, our life, our relation to God, if this is correct, if this worldview is correct, that is why these things cannot be done. Somehow you have to strip the mysteriousness and the legalism away from all of it. Or the children will be the worse and not the better. But still people say, but we know times where you tried to raise a child and they rebel against it. If you force them to do something, they rebel against it. Well, I would have two answers to that in conclusion here this morning, why that happens. First of all, the parents themselves, I think, don't have a full Christian knowledge. And then I would also say, no more important, but perhaps on the same level, that the parents don't have a relationship with their children. Are you following what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
I think you can absolutely forbid your children to do a certain thing, to think a certain thing. Tell them, I don't even want you to think about it or like it or even think that you're going to like it. I want you to stay away from that. But then, do you know, is it just I'm afraid? Is it just a fear in you? An ignorant fear of the world? Or do you really know? You know about what it is they're interested in or what it is they brought up to you. What the conclusions are, what this is going to result in. Can you articulate that, explain that to them, even down to a child's level? Use imagery or metaphor or whatever and explain, this is what it's like. God is a sovereign God and He will punish, but He's not just like what Martin Luther saw Christ with a sword. He is that. He will punish sin, but He's something else also. See, the Bible does say both of those. The fundamentalists came telling us God is nothing but a sovereign Lord with the sword raised. And today the neo-evangelicals say God is love, God is love. Well, He's both of those. I have to know both of those. I have to fear God, but I don't want to be afraid of Him as the fundamentalists were afraid. I don't think you really know God. You're afraid of a conception of an image that's not real. You're afraid of something, like we said, a superstition that doesn't even exist. God is not like that. He is a loving, gracious God. He wills our good in life, not our destruction or evil. But we can't go too far with that. We can't be too overindulgent in this area of, well, God is love and everything will work out in the long run. Children respond to legalism in a very dreadful way. That's what we're warning this morning. But let me give you a for instance. Just a for instance here. Let's say, for example, that when all of my girls reach a certain age, I won't say what age, but just whatever age, when my girls reach a certain age, that their parents, their mother and father, will not allow them to wear pants or blue jeans anymore. It's one thing just to say you can't wear blue jeans, you can't wear pants. It's another thing, I'm assuming for sake of argument, this is a hypothetical example here. That's one thing. It's another thing, can you explain to them? Do they understand what the issue is? So that not only do they obey, but they understand why they're obeying, they choose to obey. Too many times things have been forced on people. And I'm not saying you shouldn't force it. You're an adult. A child is a child. They do what the adult wants them to do. People hear me say one thing and they think that I'm saying the opposite. Oh, you're saying we shouldn't force our children. No, but I'm saying too many times people force something on their children. And that child rebels. They do it, but they do it in spite of you. They don't do it because of you. They do it in spite of you. And you and your children, you're going to reap the consequences of that in the long run. There is another way in which it can be enforced. This is what you're going to do. But somehow we've got to bring into it a full worldview, what I would call a full Christian knowledge. So many people are so deficient in that area. They're just, as I say, afraid, they're superstitious, and they're legalistic. And that really is the basis for all the things they do or don't do. They're superstitious and they're legalistic. We can't be that way. It's going to have dreadful results on the children. Now see, most of the children are very young here. It's different. We're not getting into raising children. That's another topic. It is different whenever you get into this halfway through your child rearing years and your child has already learned how to live like the devil. And then the whole family gets saved. That's not exactly what we're talking about right now. You have to interpret what we're saying now in light of your experience and in light of your situation. But we're not talking about that for most people here. Most of us here have children born right here, right now in the church. And so that's not like trying to convince a 13-year-old after he's been in the world for 13 years, you got to give all that stuff up now. It's easier to convince sometimes a 33-year-old to give it up. 13-year-old thinks, I'm just beginning to enjoy life, and now you're taking everything away from me. 33-year-old, he's already been through it. He says, I thought I was going to enjoy life, but I didn't. I'm glad God's taking all that garbage away from me now. But when you start off as young as our children are, that's a different matter. So I would just ask that we all consider this. That's why I wanted to spend extra time here on legalism. These are two positions, legalism and superstitiousness, for being a world denier. Well, I don't let my children wear this, and my girls don't wear this, and my boys don't do that, and they don't go here, and they don't own that. Praise God, all the do's and the don'ts, if they're biblical do's and don'ts. But let's hope they've got good philosophy behind them. They've got good family life behind them. Most of these ministers where the PKs, the preacher's kids, have revolted later, I'll tell you what, those ministers were only concerned about preaching on Sunday morning and being in the spotlight and talking to everyone and shaking the ladies' hands in church, and he didn't love his children. I'm convinced of that. I think the Word of God says if you bring your children up right, when he's old, he won't depart from those ways. So I can't help but believe these ministers who have the children revolting, they've done something wrong in the raising of their children. They're missing some ingredient in family life. And I think I know what it is. They're missing love. They don't have a relationship with their children. It's as though the only time you see Dad is when he's telling you can't do this. Then that's your image of Dad. They don't see Dad when he loves them, when he plays with them, when he gets down on their level, as well as when he tries to bring them up to his level of biblical understanding. There a child gets to see their full father. I think a lot of fathers as well as mothers aren't full. They're not complete. They're emasculated. They don't have anything but the don't mentality. That is, that have been raised in this tradition. They don't have anything but the don't mentality. That's all the child sees. When I hear Dad, he's always saying I can't or don't. And that child thinks, bless God or bless the devil, whoever he's going to choose to swear by. Just wait. Just wait. When I get 16, I'll show you something. Or when I get 18, I'll show you and Mom something. I can't picture a biblically raised child ever even entertaining such notions or thoughts. I just can't picture that. And the proof of the pudding will be in the eating as we go along. And I'm always willing to let time be the test. We'll let the test of time be the test, and we'll see whether or not it works. Other people say, oh, it won't work. You make your children go to your church and believe these things, and it won't work when they grow older. Well, we're willing to wait. I bet those people, whenever the day comes, somehow they'll come up with a new argument. Well, you brainwashed them. That's how you got them to stay there. They won't accept defeat in the argument. They said they'll run away from home later on. They won't accept your beliefs whenever they get older. We say that they will. So let's wait till the end, and then let's get back together. But you see, they'll have a new excuse by then. They're not willing to admit defeat.
That's right.
They'll say somehow you brainwashed them, somehow you tricked them into it, or you forced them into liking it, and it's really not them. You're living your life through them. Or they'll have some Freudian way of explaining it. But I think the Word of God, it's just natural. Parents in America today, and I can see why they fear what their children are going to be whenever they grow up, how they're going to turn out. I just see it as so natural. I wouldn't have to have a verse in Proverbs that said if you teach your child in the way that he'll go, when he's old, he'll not depart from it. I wouldn't have to have a verse that says that as a proof text. I would just think that is what the life of the Christian is all about. When you live the full Christianity, and you share full Christianity with your family members, with your children, they're going to grow up in it. How could they grow up away from it? That would be beyond my wildest imagination. And any exception you think you know of, remember this, I would say it's not an exception. I said if you have full Christian knowledge and you bring your children up with full Christian knowledge, then they won't. If you think you know an exception, I'll go back and say, I bet somewhere something was missing in this family. Somehow legalism and superstition were still on the throne in this family. Love was lacking. A family relationship was lacking here. Those children wanted to get away from their parents. They didn't sense so much love and security as well as wisdom and guidance that they were just willing to live at home forever. They never felt the need to, well, I don't want to do this or do that. Their parents were always so right about so many things. The child thinks, well, why ever go away and have to live a life on my own? It's easier just to stay right here at home. Very few children look at their parents like that. They're so wise and so good and so overall in all areas correct and beautiful that I choose to follow their ways. I see what it's done for them in their life. Look how they've been blessed. Look how they have turned out. I don't even see a risk that would be involved if I choose to follow their way of living then. That's what I think that our children will be like if we raise them the right way.